throughout the rest of the world, particularly to Asia. And so looking at China and also South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, this becomes the new labor source where people are being commodified as this kind of human capital of labor. So for the most part, folks didn't come over in the same way that they would have in the transatlantic slave trade from Africa, but they were signed into these kind of indentured servitude contracts. And so this contributes to a large amount of labor coming into places around the world, and in some cases into the United States. But it really wasn't until the California gold rush in the 1840s when we start to see a mass migration of Chinese peoples who are choosing to come here by their own volition. Largely coming to California, which was kind of colloquially known as Gold Mountain, this idea that you could come to the West and make a fortune for yourself with the hope and intent of eventually coming back to China. So this kind of, you can see in 1849, there's only 54 documented Chinese living in the United States. By 1876, that grows to 116,000 people. So these decades of gold mining really did increase the community to something that was basically non-existent to a tangible minority of people living in the West Coast and the Western territories. And so at first, Chinese were welcomed as kind of a cheap alternative to some of the native Californian labor. But as the Chinese began to amass their own fortune, began to pool their funds, create mining companies, create cohorts where people are helping each other to build a community, this began to interfere with the business of a lot of these California nativist farmers and miners as well. So the first kind of legislation that we see that's being levied on the Chinese community specifically is what's called a foreign miners tax. And this was an idea where basically every person of foreign heritage, a non-American born person who is a miner, was meant to have this tax levied against them, but it was really just being applied to people of Chinese ancestry. So it was kind of in law written to apply to all non-Americans who were in the mining industry, only really being applied towards the Chinese at that time period. So as folks begin to move out of mining because of the unfair taxation practices, there's a couple of different industries that they go into. Some of the labor camps, which are predominantly male, over 90% men living in these labor camps, certain tertiary businesses like the restaurant industries, or in some cases laundry, became industries that the Chinese were turning to instead because they wouldn't have to pay this foreign miners tax. And then, of course, labor continues into the transcontinental railroad. One of the interesting things about this whole time period is that despite the fact that, at least in the case of the Central Pacific Railroad, 90% of the workers were Chinese, yet historically, the kind of credit has not gone to that community. And so, those of us who know our history, those of us who have a community focus on history know that this was the case. But for example, this very famous photograph they'll take at Promontory Point in Utah when they complete the two railroads unified together, noticeably missing are any of the Chinese laborers. And so side by side we have a reimagining of what that scene may have looked like from a Chinese-American perspective. So, again, thinking about as this labor shifts from different industry to industry throughout this time period, agriculture becomes the next big push. Once the railroads are completed, we start to see a lot of folks becoming migrant workers, traveling the seasons between harvesting or planting crops. And for the most part, the Asian migrants, in particular the Chinese, were willing to work longer hours for shorter wages, and this kind of made them very competitive. But unfortunately also led to a lot of anti-Asian racism amongst the nativist white farm labor. So for the most part, we start to see these growing sentiments from within the communities of laborers who are majority poor European-descended peoples who are living in the Western territories, feeling that they are being out-competed by the Chinese immigrants. And we have what develops as the Yellow Peril. So this is kind of a concept that exists within popular news media throughout the 1860s and beyond, really
due to the changes in immigration patterns and due to the changes of the roles of Chinatowns across the country, Chinatowns are known as gateways for new immigrants. And the essayists were saying that that role has changed. Immigrants no longer have to lie to the urban center. They can go directly to the suburban areas. So that was a few years ago, but for the last 10 years, we've sort of seen a counter to that prediction. And so our Chinatown is growing significantly. And not only that in population, but we've become known as we've had a greater reputation and known as a destination, not just for Philadelphia, but for visitors in the greater Philadelphia area.
So piggybacking on that, I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about what brought people here to Philadelphia in the first place? I mean, it's obviously a much farther distance to travel from China to the West Coast, all the way here to Philadelphia.
Sure. In the early beginnings of Chinatown, it was mostly men, Paul and Rob's lecture on the history of the Asian American immigrant coming to this country. Men arrived in this country to help build the railroads, and when those job opportunities sort of were taken away, they moved into different industries, laundries and restaurants. So it was really a bachelor society, and that was very true for our Chinatown here in Philadelphia. Chinatown history, there's 9 associations that started in the early years of Chinatown. All these associations were really, the members were all bachelors due to the immigration laws and restrictions. There's only males that really were allowed to come to this country. So for a very long time, it was a male-dominated Chinatown here in Philadelphia and across the country. And for our family, my father came from a village in Toisan, and he arrived in the port of Baltimore and worked there for a very short period of time. But his ultimate destination was here in Philadelphia because, like many immigrants that I have met in Chinatown, they follow their other folks that left China to arrive here in America. So for our family, many members from the village that we came from landed here in Philadelphia. So our neighbor that lived across the street from us established his family here. And that's why my family came. And that's the typical pattern that we see.
Great. Cassie, why don't we skip to you, because we haven't really talked about the Southeast Asian community much yet. So can you give us kind of a brief background on the Lao community here in Philadelphia? Maybe speak to the larger refugee crisis.
So I first mentioned in my intro that I was born in Thailand in a refugee camp. So like some of my peers who are my age, we have never been to Laos. And the Lao population came here as refugees as part of the Southeast Asian and Indochina refugee crisis. And so that wave also included Cambodian, Vietnamese, and I think in terms of like the U.S. version of it, it was sort of like, there's a war in Vietnam and people have to be safe, let's go get them. And so I think that there's obviously a more complicated story behind it, which is that the U.S. involvement in Laos and Cambodia in trying to win the war in Vietnam included dropping bombs, and I guess sort of like the way to rectify what they were doing was to accept the refugees that they were creating. And so I don't know the exact numbers of Southeast Asians for Lao, Cambodian, and Vietnamese, but I know that in terms of resettlement, that we were sort of just, because we were refugees, we were sort of just placed where other organizations would sponsor. So a lot of times we were sponsored by Christian organizations or like Jewish organizations. And so even though we did end up in cities like Philadelphia and Sacramento and Dallas and Minneapolis, where there are the largest numbers of Lao migrants, we also ended up in sort of like off the beaten path cities like Lowell and Elgin, and sort of like these cities that no one's really heard of, and part of the reason is because of the religious centers that took us in. And I think that for Lao Americans in particular, I'm not really sure if there's like a path for sort of following where everyone else is going, but for sure, because we're we're sort of on our own upward mobility. So like, if I buy a house, I'm not thinking about, are there other Black people there? I'm kind of just like gonna buy that house. But I think that those people have then realized that they're not surrounded by the community anymore. That like, you know, going on Facebook to connect to people isn't the same thing as being surrounded by your people. And so a lot of times, what happens is that the communities that sort of stay and flourish become destination points. And so when we have La New Year, many people will go to the other cities where there's a big temple, only because they want to be surrounded by people in the community celebrating the same cultural events as they are.
So you had mentioned the kind of connection through different religious affiliated groups that were helping to resettle refugees. I know that here in Philadelphia, Lutheran Family Services was fairly involved in at least the Vietnamese resettlement. Is that also the case for the Lao community?
I don't really know. I think it was more highest. So I would say there was like maybe a mix. Like maybe it depends on what year you came in. Yeah. So I think like after a certain quota is filled, it sort of gets regarded as ordination.
All right, so Faria, can you tell us a little bit about the South Asian community here in Philadelphia and, you know, kind of give us a brief history?
Sure. So I think the first thing that I want to say is that, you know, South Asians it's a fairly large region and it's actually quite diverse, right? There's several nation states within this body that we call South Asia. Does anyone know how many nations are in South Asia? Take a guess. 7. Exactly. Yeah, some people say 8, but we usually go with 7. So 7 different nations comprise South Asia, and you know, I would say that their history in the U.S. is Rod mentioned, is intricately tied with U.S. legislation. So in the 1800s, we had very few South Asians, and primarily at this point, I'm talking about India, right? Because at this point, India is still under British rule. In Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, there's very few. The folks that are here are primarily here for education. They're pursuing particular degrees. Very few. Actually, interesting enough, one of the very first in Philadelphia was a woman by the name of Anandabai Joshi, who came from India to study medicine, and she was the first woman from India to receive her medical degree, period, from any country at all. Sadly enough, she came in 1883, received her degree in 1886 from what was at the time called Medical College of Philadelphia, and Medical College of Pennsylvania, I'm sorry, over in East Falls, and went back to India to practice medicine and actually unfortunately died. She got a TB, but she was one of the very first. We see larger populations coming into the U.S. and into Pennsylvania and Philadelphia post-1965, when the U.S. has passed the Hart-Celler Act that Rob mentioned, and is in need for technical and skilled workers, right? And so if we look at our area, we see that the Limerick power plant had a special need for engineers and scientists to come work, right? We see that the University of Pennsylvania Dental School was offering an advanced track degree for international students, right? So we see those folks coming in to fill those particular roles. You know, with 1965, we also have the passing of Medicare and Medicaid, so we also see physicians and healthcare workers coming in from South Asia. Another thing that happens is, you know, with this particular act, we have family reunification. So as time continues to pass, the immigrants that are coming post-65, 1970, early 1980s, are establishing themselves and bringing over their spouses, their children, their parents, right? So the population continues to grow. grow. In 1971, with the independence of Bangladesh, we see Bangladeshis coming to the U.S., particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, when the U.S. passes the diversity lottery visa, which allows for individuals, particularly from Bangladesh, to come. More recently, we have seen refugees coming from Bhutan and from Nepal. We have a small community of Pakistani Christians that have arrived in Philadelphia. There's 2 churches in the Northeast. So the community is incredibly diverse and I would say growing.
So, one of the things that I didn't have a chance to mention in my lecture was the kind of fascinating history behind, obviously, the regional diversity in India, even let alone the rest of South Asia. But I think one of the stranger moments in immigration history is this kind of debate about whether Indians should be classified as Caucasian, whether they classify as white, and in between both the case of Bulcher versus the United States and Bhagat Singh Thind, I wonder if you could kind of comment on.
Sure. So as you know, Indians in the late 1880s began arriving to work as laborers on farms and on railroads, right? And they primarily came to work, to earn money, and to send it back to their families, right? So, but as they began to work, there were so many restrictions in terms of what kinds of work they could do, what kinds of opportunities they had in terms of owning land, the alien land laws, and so, there was a group that really wanted to have legal status in the U.S. The one case is in 1923, Bhagat Singh Thind applied for U.S. citizenship and was denied U.S. citizenship because he was not white. So Mr. Thind actually took this all the way to the Supreme Court to say that actually my ancestry is Caucasian because my ancestry is from the Caucasus Mountains. Right? Yes, and so he was able to provide genealogy, we're here in space of genealogy, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, I don't think so. And, refused citizenship for him. And so, even now we can think about, race for South Asians. I mean, are they white? Are they not white? Are they brown? And so it is a sort of ambiguous space that South Asians occupy, right? And we can talk more, maybe during the question and answer about how model minority might.
Actually, the Supreme Court said that because India is within the Asian triangle, that has precedence. Doesn't matter what the ethologist or anybody else says. Science doesn't matter. Of course, the Supreme Court judges were not reflecting any kind of racial prejudice of their time.
And I think the other language they used in that ruling was that he did not meet the common sense definition of white, despite him being Caucasian. So I guess, John, you had already kind of answered this question about the circumstances that brought your family to Philadelphia, at least in the sense that they came because they had other friends and family there. But so maybe we can change that a little bit. I mean, I know that you raised a family here in Philadelphia, and what has that been like to be a part of this community that has been here for so long?
Yeah, I think it's, so what I want to say about that is, Chinatown for many years, it grew out of a neighborhood that no one in the city really wanted. Chinatown had a kind of skid row where single men could rent a room for a night, bars in every corner. So it was not a neighborhood where families really wanted to raise who wanted to raise their children. And that was the history of Chinatown for many, many years, even up until the 70s. So, as a young boy in Chinatown in the 1970s, you still would see the bars in every corner. The Trocadero, how many people are familiar with the Trocadero? It's like a music venue now. But in the 70s, it was a burlesque venue. Where the Friendship Gate is, there was, I think I was too young to understand this, but at the corner of 10th and R Street across from the Trocadero, there was a place called a modeling agency. I really didn't know what that was. But I knew that it had a light-skinned African-American woman with blonde hair sitting on her chair outside the door in the summertime with very little clothing on. And then I didn't understand until I was much older. It was meant that when I take pictures, women would go to this place. So this was a neighborhood that many Chinese families grew up in. But why would Chinese families want to grow up in a neighborhood like this? And that's because I've talked to many people. Chinatown is not just a destination, but it's a community. It's a community where people who are Chinese or of Asian descent can come to, and they feel safe. They can interact with people that speak their language and look like them, and not have to deal with any bigotry or racism. So in many ways, Chinatown, the neighborhood, offers this kind of safety net for families. So for my family, I grew up in Chinatown, moved out, raised my family outside Chinatown, Mount Laurel, New Jersey. But we would find ourselves every weekend coming to Chinatown because I understood what this community offered families and their children. They offer a strong cultural identity, which sometimes as young children growing up outside Chinatown, you have this struggle, you have this mainstream idea of what culture is supposed to be like, but you don't look like mainstream. And I think coming to Chinatown, that offers you this feeling of security and commonality. So we made the move back into the city, and my children basically grew up in Chinatown. Although we don't live here, we're here almost every day. And I think my children, both of them, really appreciate the feeling of culture that they obtain in the language too.
Absolutely. So Cassie, I wonder, can you tell us a little bit more then about kind of where in Philadelphia you grew up? Was there a Lao community around you, and is there one now in any kind of concentration?
So when I was growing up, the Lao community was concentrated mostly in South Philly, where I grew up, particularly on 7th Street, in between 4th and Snyder. And then in North Philly in the Logan section, and then also in West Philly, which unfortunately there is no more. All of the residents have since moved on. I think the only quote-unquote West Philly resident is Asiatic Cafe, which is a restaurant on 48th of Baltimore, and they actually used to live on Fulton in Simpson, where all the other families were. And if you don't know their story, they basically got their start by selling or hawking food. I mean, like they would sell at different places like temples and stuff like that, and then they would. Some of the neighbors smelled how good the food was, and they started knocking on the doors and asking, can you sell me some? And for a while it was sort of like a speakeasy, and it was called Blue Tent Cafe, I think, or it was just called Blue Tent because you just go sell like the blue tarp in your backyard, and eventually they got caught, but then the community loved them so much that they helped them get a license to open up the restaurant. So there are no more Lao people living in West Philly. And in terms of the stores, there used to be two in West Philly, one on 46th and Sampson, and then another I think on 43rd and Locust. That store is still there, it's just owned by somebody else. And then In South Philly, there were a little bit more, but they've since closed up because if you've ever been to Center Street in South Philly, you see that there's lots of Southeast Asian stores and they almost all sell the same thing. So it's really hard to compete, especially if it's like the size of your store manages how much market you get. And so we have one store left, and they're currently closed because the owner's on vacation and there's like a rumor that she might retire this year. And so, you know, a lot of people in the community sort of are sad about it. You know, we're happy that she can retire and do whatever she wants, but some people are sad because they're, you know, it allows for, especially for people who are visiting this, like the place that you go, if you want to buy anything that is specific to you. And, you know, in addition, some of the adults will just go to the store and hang out just because they know that a lot of people want to come here. So it's sort of like a place of community. So even if they're not buying anything, we sort of just hang out outside and they know that people can just come and see, you know, your child son or whoever, something you've not seen in a while. But yeah, that's pretty much those are the pockets.
In terms of places of worship, Wat Lao is on 20th in Washington, right?
So what about this means about Temple, and there's two of them. There's one in South Philly on 20th in Washington, and then there's one in North Philly off of Rise and 72. Where are we going? Sorry.
And are those kind of also convening points then?
They are. I think that, you know, some people have recognized that that's where a lot of people go, and so that's like a convenient place to have a health fair. In addition, Lao New Year festivals tend to attract lots of people because it's like kind of the only time that people get to really celebrate. And so a lot of times, in addition to the religious activities that we do, they will have vendors selling things, and so it becomes like a bigger attraction because it's kind of like, you know, when can I ever get, you know, a silk from Laos, you know, because people are sort of, this is the only place to get it.
Great. So Faria, I wonder if you could comment on what brought you or your family to Philadelphia?
So, you know, post-65, when the U.S. needed healthcare workers, actually my father came, he was a pharmacist, and arrived in New York. And then we eventually and then my mother and I joined him. We eventually moved to Baltimore and then onward to Philadelphia, where I've since lived. And I would say, you know, his story, our story, is a fairly typical one of New York City serving as sort of a main starting point for many immigrants from South Asia, because it's a large community, lots of networking, and then folks move on from there. For example, the Bangladeshi community, many begin their journey to the U.S. in New York, but then find that Philadelphia is actually a place that has, you know, cheaper housing, more educational opportunities, and the cost of living is more manageable, and so we move to Philadelphia.
And as far as like pockets of community, I know like Upper Darby has a fairly significant.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, you know, and it strikes me as John was talking about Chinatown. You know, for South Asians, there is no Little India, there is no, you know, Pakistan town or, you know, any particular area that where people would convene, and the population is pretty spread out, and it depends on when your point of migration occurred as to where you may live, right? So if you were an engineer in the early 70s and you came to work at Limerick, you may be then living in the suburbs, right? There's a large community of, I would say, newer immigrants from South Asia that, as you mentioned, Ron, in Upper Darby, and that would include folks from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh. There's also communities in the Northeast. Again, from those three nations, those three have the largest populations in the U.S.
small town mentality. You know, West Coast, that's where many of the Chinese railroad workers arrive from the West Coast, west coming to the east. So in terms of the development of the Chinese Americans, they migrated from the west to the east coast. So Philadelphia's Chinatown, we're much smaller than the San Francisco Chinatown. But I think one thing that's different about our Chinatown is that in many ways we've benefited from this phenomenon that where Philadelphia is a much more affordable place to live. So there's no doubt that New York is a destination for many Chinese immigrants coming to America. You know, Lower Manhattan, Flushing, Brooklyn. So that's just the amount of the population growth in New York has just exploded. But from that, many Chinese have realized that Philadelphia is much more affordable. We saw that migration back in the mid to late 2000s. And they were buying houses and homes in South Philadelphia and Northeast Philadelphia. But one of the problems is the Chinatown economy here could not sustain the need for jobs from the immigrants moving in. So I would say that the differences between Arizona here and the West Coast is that we're much smaller, I think we're growing more rapidly. We continue to be a gateway for new immigrants. Whereas in the West Coast, I think that trend for new immigrants has slowed down, although both coasts are experiencing a lot of international students, and I'm sure you can speak to that as well, whether University of Pennsylvania, Temple, or Drexel, or any of the colleges in our Philadelphia area. That's the phenomenon that's happened for the last 10 to 15 years, just the amount of international students coming to American universities. And we see that in high school stuff.
Great, thanks. Priya, same question. What's unique about the Philadelphia South Asian American experience?
It's diverse. It's young. I think it's growing rapidly. It's changing rapidly. It isn't as old as I would say other communities, other large communities in California, in Chicago, in Houston, for example, or even, you know, in New Jersey, in Flushing, in Edison. But I would say that there's definitely a lot of young people, so it's a younger population. And it's shifting. I feel like in the past 5 years, there's been a lot of movement towards change in terms of bringing in fresh ideas, having more conversations. I've seen more South Asian groups beginning to perform. There's a film festival based on South Asian film, so that's all very exciting, and I would say, you know, pretty new in the past 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
Good, thanks. Cassie?
What is different about Philadelphia?
Yeah, what's unique in terms of the Lao and Southeast Asian experience in Philadelphia?
Versus the rest of it?
West Coast or anywhere else?
I would say new. No, I mean, so I say this jokingly because I run, in my mind, I think that I still have to like stop myself when I say I run an organization, so like, we don't really have an office, and like it's all volunteers, and so the other day somebody asked me if we were a national organization, and I was like, I don't think so, because we only just do things in Philly, and if I show up somewhere else, then it becomes like, oh, Blossom House is here, and so like it made me think like, I guess we are national, like there's no other organizations that focus on arts. I will say that the West Coast probably eats better than we do, because
I would agree with that.
because it's the climate, right? So it's like, I'm paying $3 for like 10 leaves of kaffir lime, and then they're like growing it in their backyards and sprinkling on themselves, and just that being said, like we have a new thing going on called the Lao Food Movement, which is inspired by Lao food being sort of accepted now because for a while there are lots of Thai restaurants that would employ Lao workers and like would have Lao cuisine, but because people didn't know what Laos was, it was like harder to sell, or because people wanted certain things, it was harder to sell the Lao items. And so there's a chef by the name of James Seawood who actually came out with a book called Hawker's Fare, which is through Anthony Green's company. But when he had a Thai restaurant with his mom, his mom had a restaurant and they just called it Thai food because it was easier, but they were actually just selling Lao food. And then when he finally opened up his restaurant, before he opened up Hawker's Fare, he would have like Lao food, and then he would like, it would be like a secret like menu, and you sort of have to like eat earrings and like try it, you know? And so now people are sort of like accepting of the fact that like Lao and Thai food are similar but not the same. And that there are some things that like, you know, you can only get from a Lao restaurant, or like if you know that the owner's Lao, you can ask them for it and they'll bring it out and then it'll be in the menu. And so I think that for sure that there's a lot of I think too because it's naturally with the West Coast, because in the West Coast people just drive everywhere. So like we're such a small community, so if like somebody's doing something, people will drive to go support them. Meanwhile, I'm here by myself. There are no Lao people in the audience. I know this because I asked. You know what I mean? So it's like I think it's just the nature of like you know, being in a city that's like, you know, people are used to just like small short commutes, and then like people in the West Coast just drive everywhere.
Sure. So I'm going to open up to questions in just a second, but I'm going to give like a 3-minute synopsis of what Japanese American community looks like here, in case you guys have questions about that as well. So basically, there were very, very few Japanese Americans here until World War II. There was literally about 4 dozen people here, like 42 or something like that on the census in 1940. And when Pearl Harbor was bombed, you know, obviously a lot of folks on the West Coast, over 120,000 people with Japanese ancestry end up being incarcerated, forcibly evicted from their homes and farms and lands, and put in prison camps throughout the United States. As the United States began to realize that that was such a terrible mistake because there was no military necessity for it, there were no documented cases of espionage, nothing like that, largely fueled by the kind of racist propaganda that was still within the nativist farm movements within California that are pushing for the incarceration of Japanese Americans because they had outcompeted them in many cases in California and elsewhere, in Oregon and Washington. So once the U.S. comes to this realization, you have this tremendous resettlement effort that begins to happen. And so very rapidly, Philadelphia becomes one of the major hubs for that because of the Quaker community here in Pennsylvania. And historically, Philadelphia being founded by Quakers, this idea of religious tolerance, that kind of extends into contemporary Quaker activism. And at that time period in the 1940s, when it was extremely politically untenable to be pro-Japanese or Japanese American, the Quakers were the first to reach out and say, you know, this is wrong, these people are American citizens, they prove themselves loyal even if they were born in Japan, and we need to do what we can to kind of get these people back into normal lives. So a couple of key players were here who happened to be Quaker. There was the president of Bryn Mawr and also Swarthmore, who were both Quakers. And so they began to start some efforts to found what was called the National Japanese American Student Relocation Committee. And that organization was based out of the building that now houses the 7-Eleven at the corner of 12th and Chestnut on the very top floor of that building. They were able to secure the early release from camp in 1943-44, about 7,000 Japanese American high school and college students, so that they didn't have to spend the rest of the war years behind bars. And so Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr and some of the other Quaker schools began to accept those students into their ranks. The other part of that was was that the War Relocation Authority, which was in charge of the entire incarceration and subsequent resettlement, they were based across the street from them in the Stephen Girard building at 12th and Chestnut and Market. And so they were actually also led by a Quaker gentleman who allowed a number of the early release people from camp to come through Philadelphia, resettled in a place called the Philadelphia Hostel, which was kind of like a halfway home for people who were coming out of these incarceration camps until they could find permanent residence and employment. They were living mainly in West Philly. So the original location of the Philadelphia Hostel was 32nd and Market Street, later 40th and Chestnut. And so just about every one of the families who settled here in the Philadelphia region spent some time at that Philadelphia Hostel. There was a large farming movement here that was happening kind of throughout history, and in the Quaker community as well. A couple of these farms in Kennett Square and elsewhere in New Jersey began to hire these Japanese Americans, the largest of which being Seabrook Farms, which at this time period in the 1940s was the single largest frozen foods grower and canner. And so they were mainly supplying the United States military with all the food rations. The fresh fruit and vegetable would become canned or frozen and then shipped out to the troops around the world. And it was predominantly Japanese American laborers that were working there. But you know, it provided the employment and it provided an opportunity for people to come out of camp early. And for a period of about maybe 6 years, that group of maybe 40-something people grew to about 7,000 people by the end of World War II, shrunk down again to about 3,000, where it is currently once immigration or the migration back to California was reopened to the Japanese community. So in a nutshell, that's kind of like what the Japanese American community is. There is not enough of us, obviously, to have a physical location, but many folks have ended up settling around the mainline area, Ardmore, Narberth, etc. A couple small grocery stores, Fido, Ardmore. Yeah, so I'm not sure if there's a microphone available. Yes, there is. So if people have questions, you can just raise your hands and go to the mic.
Thank you all very much for this presentation. It's fantastic to learn a lot. I was wondering if Mr. Ching could comment on the effects on Chinatown, on some of the modern development around the neighborhood. For instance, the construction of the Vine Street Expressway, or much later, the construction of the convention center.
Yeah, so our nonprofit PCPC for many decades, our mission is to protect, preserve, and promote. So, you know, I talked about Skid Row being Chinatown. So, in the 1960s, the government had these urban renewal development concept of basically wiping out the area and rebuilding it new. Because the government really saw this area as blighted, and they needed to redevelop the entire area. So it was called the Independence Mall Urban Renewal Plan. So for 3 to 4 decades, we would always be finding ourselves fighting against one project or another. So the Vine Street Expressway was the first project that our community discovered, which cut through Chinatown. But little did we know that there are also, with highways, you need on-ramps and off-ramps. These on-ramps and off-ramps would basically have wiped out the entire Chinatown. That just cut through it. So we were able to protest this highway, took our fight to Harrisburg, and I think this process started in 1966 when this community first learned about it. And not until 1993 was the highway actually constructed. So during that time, the community worked with government agencies to actually get rid of this Roosevelt Boulevard idea of a highway that cut through this area, and ended up with the highway that you see today, where they have southbound expressway with a couple service roads up top at street level. So, and then you have the convention center. You had this one really is hilarious. They proposed to build a federal prison right next door to elementary school. And at that time, anytime there was federal dollars invested in the project, they had to do an environmental impact study. So of course, you hire consultants to support whatever argument you want to make. So they hired a consultant, they reduced the study, and the study said having a prison next to elementary school would have zero impact on students in the school. So that's just an example of something. But it seemed like every 7 years some project kept up. So fortunately for BCBC's efforts and the people that lived in the community, we learned how to become grassroots advocates and take the fight to City Hall each time. And I think because of that, we're able to preserve what we have today as Chinatown, and it's growing, And I forgot to mention the casino. Unfortunately, the city has stadium, baseball stadium, but the casino, we have Sugar House now, and the second one's being built in South Philadelphia. And casinos are really not good for any community, but the government likes to tax the revenue.
Don't feel like I need this microphone. I just wanted to comment on the graphic behind you. It's just fascinating to me. I wish I could take a copy of it home. And I would like to ask the three of you to take a look at it and tell us, do you see any large changes happening in those various groups? Are there people who are really coming more part of our population, or are there people who are leaving people with a smaller part?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of the question?
Well, I'm just wondering, here we have 32,000 Chinese and 9 Tongan, and in between many numbers of different peoples. Are some of the peoples who are still coming in great numbers? Is this all very stable? Are there some of them who are leaving? Can you comment on that?
I don't think anyone's coming in great numbers, really, now to the U.S. Immigration is pretty halted. For example, Bangladeshis are primarily coming through the diversity lottery, and their quota for that has been fulfilled, so that's done. So they may be coming now through reunification, but that's probably it. For Sri Lankans, that's a very small community as well. I mean, the refugee population is almost stopped coming to Philadelphia. They're really just trickling in now. There's very few families set to come. Bhutanese, I would not imagine many are coming. Hmong, I would say no. Indians, perhaps, but they might be coming on restricted visas, which means that they might be coming to work certain periods of time, and then once that contract is over, they will return. John mentioned too, there's lots of international students coming, and that's certainly true. All the universities and many of the local high schools, particularly the private high schools, are welcoming international students, but it's harder and harder for international students to finish with a degree and to then get a job to reside in the U.S. It's just very hard. Yeah, I don't know, John, if you have something to add.
How about the Chinese?
The Chinese, so as far as the category of immigrants, it's slow. The immigration policy needs to be fixed. So you have family sponsoring family members of state. It takes years, sometimes decades. But I would say that Chinese migration from other cities to Philadelphia, we see that. We see that definitely from the New York City area. That's for sure. So this data is from 2010, whereas 2018 today. So I would say that some of these groups, we have seen the growth from 2010 to 2017 up until the new White House administration, where immigration is basically stopped. So the Bhutanese are established there, and then since 2010 to 2018, there has been migration of Bhutanese coming to Philadelphia. And they're established, they have social organizations supporting their own indigenous population. But yeah, I would agree with her sense of the migration right now.
And, and I would add too is that when we think back about our city, I mean, I just drove from University City down South Street here, and it's a beautiful day. We've had lots of rain. Everyone's outside, and it's a vibrant city, right? And even driving through, I noticed all of these different types of ethnic foods, right? All these restaurants, and Kathy's saying. And I just want to remind folks that, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, I mean, Philadelphia was not what Philadelphia is today, right? I went to Drexel many moons ago, and at 5 o'clock, the city shut down. Right? I mean, there were no sidewalk cafes, people were not hanging out, meeting friends, and nothing, right? Does anyone remember that Philadelphia in the 80s? Right? I mean, it was the white flight, right? And so who rebuilt this city? It was really immigrants, right? It was the refugees that came in and stayed here while there was lots of departures.
There's a question.
I think I need a mic. I have a question. My observation, maybe it's not 100% accurate, is that I have noticed in the history of U.S., whether it's politics or even Fortune 500 companies, I notice when you see the names of these people who have succeeded, whether it's in political arena, whether it's legal, medicine, a lot of times it's Indian names or Southeast Indian names. Even Fortune 500 companies, when you look at the list of top CEOs or CFOs, why do you think that's the phenomenon among all of our demographics? I notice that Indians are succeeding at a higher rate than even Chinese, Koreans. So this is what I observed when I see this stuff. Why do you think that's the case?
So, India is vast, right? It has a vast population, right? And so they're the largest numbers in the U.S. That's one. Okay? And also because, I don't want to hear your whole history, but Nehru, right after partition, decided that in order to modernize India, he was going to focus on sciences. So he encouraged his citizens to go abroad to study and to bring that knowledge back, right? And so that was really a big part of the national agenda there. And it came at the same time that the U.S. needed that kind of labor, right? And so we have that happening. We have skilled people in fulfilling those particular needs, right? But I would say, yes, by and large, there's a specific population of Indian Americans that are successful, but there's still a vast population from India that are struggling.
No,
right?
So I'm talking about the CEOs. I'm talking about like Tom names or like what's his name in New Jersey? What's his name? He's a Sikh. He's the first Sikh, isn't he? New Jersey.
Mayor?
Not the mayor. The Edison. Attorney General. Example. That's one example. Or the governor of Louisiana was Indian, like that kind of stuff. And then the Indian but I mean just saying. And then what I'm saying is
U.S. ambassador.
yes, and the lady Kamala, she's half Indian. So I'm just saying, it seems to me when I see the people in those status versus Chinese, I feel like there are more. When I look at the Fortune 500, the top leaders, I see more Indian names versus Chinese names.
So I think that for sure there is a disparity of like South Asian successes versus like other Asians. I mean, I think that our stories, our immigration stories are very, very different. So whether or not we came here as immigrants, meaning that we planned to come here versus being refugees, which is, it was a lottery and America was the choice, that, the success I think is related to that story. I'm not saying that if you're a refugee, you would never be a CEO. I just think that circumstantially, that, how you got here and how you had to settle and everything you had to do has a lot to do with that. The other, I had another point I totally forgot it. I'll let you finish it. But I just wanted to talk about that. That, you know, like again, like there's a thing that happens where you say Asian and it becomes like one dog in the story, and it's like, no. There's so many of us, and just like she mentioned, there are like many nation states, and even in Laos, there's like, you know, 42 ethnicities, you know, so it's really hard to really say why, you know, something happens with one group versus another, you know, so, and like she said, just because if you make it, there are a lot who do not ever, and their stories never get told.
Can I add a point real quick? Language is another big thing. Within the history of nativist discourse within the United States, English language has been part of that legal structure for a very long time. And from South Asia, you have, or from the subcontinent, you have English, native-born English speakers much longer than other Asian communities.
Right, because, you know, we were colonized and forced to speak English.
Right, nativist kind of.
Right, yeah. So that definitely plays a part of it, right? And so definitely assists in if you decide in your path to assimilation.
We have time for a few more questions, so why don't we just do the hands that are up?
I have one more thing I plan on remembering. So, which you were mentioning politics. I mean, I think that, I guess I'm just thinking from my point of view as a librarian, that sometimes when immigrants or refugees come over, it's because of politics and war. And so a lot of times, when it comes time to resettle into American culture, they don't want to participate, right? And so one of the things that we talk about too is like getting Asian Americans to vote, but like for some of our people, they don't even know what voting is because they never had before, but also like the idea of registering your name somewhere and then letting the government have it is very scary. And so for many people, like being apolitical is the safest thing to do.
That's true. So, you know, to add on to that, you know, there's a lot involved in regards to how adverse certain communities are to risk. So, you know, when we look at CEOs or CFOs of companies or elected officials, you know, there's a certain amount of risk that's involved that you have to assume, and some people are adverse to that because they're afraid of failure. Because at one point in time in the history of Asians being in the United States, failure was not an option because we worked really hard to survive. So, you know, you look at the East Coast, West Coast, you know, we have a lot of Asian American legislators. We're starting to see more Asian American legislators here on the East Coast, and I believe we have Pearl Kim in the back who's actually running for Congress. But, you know, and I no matter what party you're running under, I give somebody like Pearl a lot of credit because she's willing to take that risk and put herself out there. So it's even just like in the corporate world, how much risk is somebody willing to take to try to climb the corporate ladder? So I think it's a matter of time before more Asian Americans are going to be seen at the higher levels of the corporate ladder because they're going to be acclimated more to taking that kind of risk and knowing how to tackle the risk.
The issue of language has come up a few times, and I wanted to maybe ask John. I grew up in California I'm a third generation American. And I grew up with classmates who were Chinese Americans, also third generation. And for those Asian Americans who have multiple generations in this country, we've lost things like language competence, reading or writing. I can't speak or read, write Japanese, even though people ask me all the time. The point is, as time goes on with every ethnic population, there is this Americanization process going on. And I was just wondering, since you've been associated with Chinatown so long, what sort of global evolution have you seen? Because when I was growing up in California, my father liked to go shopping in Chinatown, San Francisco, and most of the people spoke Chinese were speaking Cantonese. By the time I finished Berkeley, and a few years after that, the population language had shifted to Mandarin. And I was just wondering if in Philadelphia this kind of evolution has taken place and how it has played out in terms of people within the Chinese American community getting involved in politics, in social welfare, social activism, etc. Because language is what holds everything together and conveys ideas.
So, yes, language has shifted here in Philadelphia to Chinatown, from Cantonese to Mandarin speakers. But it's interesting, China's one language policy is Mandarin. So anyone, I don't know, that grew up after the revolution was taught Mandarin or speak Mandarin. So that's what we see here in Philadelphia. But interesting enough, although people, the national language is Mandarin, people in Philadelphia, and I know this, is they still retain their own hometown dialect. So you have Fujianese, Fuzhou, speaking Fujianese and Mandarin. You still have Cantonese speakers from southern China, Guangdong, speaking Cantonese, but they speak Mandarin. And then from where my family is in southern China, Toisan, they speak Mandarin and they speak Toisan. So there's still dual language going on, but the official language is Mandarin. And that's how, I guess, those people from different regions of China speak their own language.
Well, just to add to that, that phenomenon, the shift from Cantonese to Mandarin, that's in every Chinatown in the United States. When you go to California, it has shifted to Mandarin. You go to San Francisco, it has shifted to Mandarin. Every pocket of Chinatown that exists in the United States and Canada has all shifted. And that has a lot to do with the region and where they're coming from. The initial Chinese immigrants were from southern China. They're from Canton. So even though they might have spoken little distinct Cantonese, they were able to understand the Cantonese. And a lot of them were uneducated in Mandarin. You know that. The elder generation did not know Mandarin at all. The ones who are in the 80s and 90s years old. So because the shift of immigration, they're coming over from Fuzhou and other parts of China now, common language is Mandarin. So if you don't know Mandarin now, your kids are not in Chinatown.
So we had our last question here.
Hi, so kind of touched on law minority for a second, and I was really interested in, I guess, what your personal experiences with that have been, especially being in the arts, and kind of speak to the ways in which they've affected our kind of diasporic identity, both positively and negatively. And
Model minority myth is that that Asians just do well, and it's used as a tool to be divisive to other communities as well. So it's like, oh, look at those hardworking, studious Asian immigrants. They can do it. Why can't you? You know, so, and sort of, yeah. So that's not. I mean, it's hard to. I don't know. It's not positive. It seems that way on the surface, but it's not, because again, it's used as a tool for other communities, mostly people of color. But also, I mean, I think in the expansive conversation about Asian Americans, that like we're focusing on those who are CEOs and whatever, and they're doing well. So you're not thinking about the refugees who are recently arrived, or those who weren't recent immigrants and like have been here for years and years and years, but still are living in poverty, you know, or sort of like struggling with life. I mean, in terms of me as an artist, I mean, I already knew that, that like, you know, that I would be compared to other people who chose to be doctors or lawyers or whatever, and then like being an artist, you know, why? And for me, to answer that question, again, it came down to language, which was, you know, I know that in order to get the history, our history, we had to interview our elders. Because, you know, obviously it's not included in our history books, but like in order to like have that conversation, you know, I wanted to be able to ask the questions about war and refugee camps and all that stuff without re-traumatizing them over and over. And so for me, art was sort of like that language, and sort of like put it in front of them. And, you know, if they felt compelled to share, or if they like were okay with, you know, this exhibit and not saying anything else that was wrong with me. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the model minority myth is especially harmful because I've seen it happen before where people sort of say even to immigrants, and like, because they think there's sort of like a formula for success. You know, like if you're a first generation, you should enroll in college, and then by the second generation, you should have a house for your grandparents to live in, and you know, all this other stuff. And like about fourth generation, you're supposed to have a house that lasts for them to like. You know what I mean? So like people seem to think that there's like this formula of success that like we're supposed to follow, and if you don't follow it, you're not successful.
You know, I would add that it's incredibly problematic, right? I mean, because one, it minoritizes you. You're no matter how long you've been in the country, no matter if you're born here, whether or not you pay your taxes, you are a minority, you will not be white, right? That's what it's telling you. And it's built upon the backs of other people of color. So you're the model, well, what about the rest, right? And that is, you know, as Cassie said, it's incredibly divisive, and it's incredibly problematic, right? And I teach this in my classes. Many of my students are like, well, I think it's okay because, you know what, I'm going to use that to get a job, right? So, yes, I'm brown and Indian, and so they'll know that I'll be able to do those problem sets, right? The problem is that you're going to be doing all of the problem sets, right? And getting paid less than your white coworker, right? And you just threw out your black friend, right, under the bus. So that's not okay, right? And you know, it definitely, I think it would probably play out in all of our lives. I mean, you know, I came when I was 4 to the U.S. You know, I spent my entire life educated in the U.S. I have a master's degree from Yale. I have a PhD from Penn. And, you know, every so often, I get complimented on my English.
It is pretty good.
So to me, that's a constant reminder, like, yeah, you're really successful, like in X, Y, and Z categories, but you're still not American.
The idea of like perpetual foreigner.
Professional, correct. Yeah, and so I can be both, right? I can be the model minority, and I can be the perpetual foreigner, okay?
John, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add very quickly that, yes, this is true for anything. If you work hard at something, you're going to get better at it, whether it's studies, sports, or anything. So if we look at the model minority myth, just ask yourself, well, if there's a group that's a model minority, let's look at the boardrooms of the Fortune 500. All right, let's look at the CEOs. How many of those minorities are sitting in those boardrooms? Okay, so that's what I have to say.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of quickly respond to that and then close out the panel. But, you know, I think one of the most difficult things about the model minority myth is that American people know where it originated from. But there's a sociologist named William Peterson who in the 1960s, in the midst of the civil rights era, wrote this very influential article that was about the Japanese Americans. And he specifically called out Japanese Americans as a model minority. So lawyers and raised up the community by their bootstraps. But the problem of that is, our whole community was really pissed off about that still, right? So one, you can't exactly equate that to saying, okay, they just did what they had to do sort of thing, when there's an incredible amount of trauma that kind of continues to plague our community today, even in the generations that weren't born at that time period. And you kind of think about what nuance there is in that kind of conversation, and unfortunately, how that was politicized at that time period to basically drive a wedge between Asian Americans and other communities of color in the midst of the civil rights era. And that's something that unfortunately has kind of continued until today. So, when you kind of look at it from the long view of history, I think this is why it's so important we tell our stories. It's really important that we have these kinds of conversations and panels and movies and poems and songs, etc. Because until and unless we're able to give these very nuanced, detailed perspectives from all of these communities that you see here, even if there's only 9 people, it's really important because all of our experiences are so different from each other and all of our lived experiences are completely in contrast in many cases. So, just a big thank you to our panelists for this.